Leroy was at the store looking through the bouquets of flowers. It was Valentine's Day, the day when his school allowed students to bring in flowers and give them to their crushes, and Leroy was hoping to present the best flowers he could find to his crush, Bailey. He looked at several before deciding on a nice full bouquet of blue, white, and red flowers. He took them to the counter, paid for them and happily made his way to school. When he arrived, he saw a ton of his fellow students holding flowers. One such student was his best friend Terry. Terry was looking at the flowers in his hand and looking quite sad by himself on the side of the entrance gate. Leroy called his name and waved to him, and instantly Terry's face lit up and he smiled and waved back. Leroy walked over and started talking to him. After a bit of idle chat, Leroy asked him why he was so sad, and being a bit blunt, he asked if his crush rejected him. Terry turned bright red and rubbed the back of his head. He admitted he hadn't even asked yet and that he was so nervous about it going wrong and that they might hate him for even asking. Being a good friend, Leroy encouraged him to go for it, that anyone would be lucky to be loved by him. Terry was a bit embarrassed but was smiling, and then he asked Leroy who the flowers he got were for. Leroy then explained that he got them for Bailey and was going to confess his feelings for her. Terry smiled awkwardly but, like a good friend, said he was rooting for Leroy. After that, the two waved goodbye to each other and Leroy headed inside while Terry continued to look down at his flowers. Leroy walked through the halls and looked for Bailey. He ended up finding her on the third floor outside her classroom with a bunch of other girls. Leroy approached her and she turned around and held her hands behind her back for some reason. Leroy began to talk with her and it was going well until he attempted to present the flowers to her. Instead of taking them and being happy, she looked a bit sad. Leroy was a bit confused, as up until this point it seemed like they'd gotten along well and that there was definitely some sort of connection between them, so he was almost sure she would accept his flowers today. So why wasn't she? Well, that was because she had already accepted flowers from someone. She pulled her hands out from behind her back and showed Leroy. She apologized to Leroy and told him she couldn't accept them but said she'd be happy to remain friends. Leroy nodded and walked away without saying much. He didn't want to show it, but he was crushed and hurt inside. He was disappointed, jealous, angry, all kinds of mixed emotions he couldn't get a handle on, so he decided to skip his first class and go sit in the school's courtyard. He sat there looking into his flowers. Why was love so hard? Why couldn't Leroy find someone who truly cared for him and that he truly cared about? Leroy sighed and picked a flower with a ton of petals on it. He looked at it and plucked a petal off of it. Then he said, "I'll never find love." He plucked another and said, "I'll find love." One after another he plucked the petals from the flower until there was only one left. He plucked it. "If the flowers are to be believed, I'll find love," Leroy said as he let out a small smile, finding some comfort in the silly game with the flowers. He was about to get up and throw the flowers away when suddenly a ton of the petals blew off of the bouquet and started to swirl around him. The petal continued to surround him until he was completely surrounded by a ball. Then they all suddenly moved in close to him and covered his body from head to toe. It was hard to tell what was going on, but Leroy could tell something was happening to his body. Leroy was covered for what felt like a few minutes before the petals came off of her and blew away as if they were never there. Leroy was confused and looked at the flowers she had. All of them still had their petals and were fully intact, so where did the petals go? Maybe she had imagined it. She shrugged and prepared to stand up when she noticed someone had been standing in front of her. It was Terry, who was looking at her with a surprised look on his face and the bouquet of flowers still in his hands, which he was extending forward for some reason. Leroy saw her friend and greeted him and asked him if he was okay, and Terry didn't say anything for a few seconds and then asked Leroy if she was okay. Leroy tilted her head and said she was a bit down, but things would be okay. Then she asked why he seemed so worried. Terry turned bright red and told Leroy to look at herself. Confused, Leroy looked down. She was surprised to see a dark blue skirt, a white button-up, and a blue neck scarf. Leroy turned bright red and asked how the hell she ended up in a schoolgirl outfit. Terry explained that when he walked over here to talk to her, Those flower petals completely surrounded Leroy, and when she came out, she was wearing that. Leroy was freaking out. She couldn't be at school in the girl's uniform, and she could get in trouble or be laughed at. Terry told Leroy that he didn't think she had anything to worry about. Leroy asked what he was talking about, and Terry blurted and said that Leroy had also turned into a girl. Leroy looked at Terry in disbelief and then looked down at herself. Now that he mentioned it, Leroy felt smaller, and there was clearly something under her shirt around the chest area. Leroy slowly reached up and pressed her hands against them, and sure enough, her chest had grown. Leroy still didn't fully believe she had turned into a girl, but there was one spot that would confirm it. So she pressed her legs together, expecting something down there to hurt, but instead it only proved how flat her downstairs area had become. Leroy started freaking out about becoming a girl, while Terry just watched awkwardly with his hands still extended. After the initial shock wore off, Leroy finally noticed the flowers Terry was holding towards her. She looked a bit annoyed and asked if he was really trying to hit on her the second she magically turned into a girl. Terry turned bright red and swore it wasn't like that. Terry hastily explained that he had walked over to Leroy while she was picking the petals of the flower, and that's when he extended his hand. After that, the petals appeared and transformed her, and he was just so shocked he hadn't moved. That brought up another question in Leroy's mind: why was Terry attempting to give her flowers in the first place? Terry became extremely awkward and looked down at the ground and mumbled to himself for a minute before Leroy again asked the question. That's when Terry shouted out that he had a crush on Leroy, and he had gotten the flowers for her in the first place. Leroy's eyes opened wide. Terry liked her, and not just because she had suddenly turned into a girl. Leroy was speechless. She looked down at herself and then back at Terry. She asked him if he still felt that way after the sudden change. Terry stopped being embarrassed and smiled. He said he loved who she was. What body she was in didn't matter to him. Terry had loved Leroy for as long as he could imagine and really never thought it was possible between them, but Terry knew he had to finally come clean and tell Leroy how he felt, but the thought of losing Leroy as a friend was why he was sitting at the gate this morning moping. He then pushed the flowers closer to Leroy and asked her if she would accept his flowers. Leroy looked down at them. They were red and white roses, and they had an amazing smell. Leroy looked back up and looked Terry in the eyes. This was her best friend. They did everything together, and there was no one in this world she trusted more than him. Like Terry, she never saw a world where the two of them would be together. Heck, she never saw a world where she was a girl and dated a boy. But this wasn't just a boy. It was Terry, the most amazing and kind boy she ever met. He was definitely someone she loved dearly. This was all so sudden and her heart was fluttering. Was this what true love felt like? Was she really going to accept the flowers and perhaps stay a girl? As her thoughts flooded with emotions and thoughts, she saw a petal fly off of one of the flowers in the bouquet she was holding. It flew right onto Terry's cheek and he blushed as he reached up with his free hand and removed it. Almost like an anime, Terry looked so cute and dreamy with light shining behind him. Leroy smiled and looked at his flowers. She agreed to take them but only on one condition. Terry looked amazed and said if she was serious, he'd do whatever she wanted. Leroy took the flowers from Terry and reached out her other hand with the flowers she had bought. Terry looked confused, and then Leroy asked if he'd accept her flowers in exchange. Terry's confusion faded and he smiled and agreed. He took the flowers from Leroy and smelled them. He told her they were wonderful and thanked her for them. Leroy smiled back at him and said the ones he got were much better. Terry looked a bit embarrassed but brushed it off by saying they both got really nice flowers. He then asked Leroy if she wanted to head back to class. Leroy nodded, grabbed his hand and squeezed it in hers. As they walked back, Leroy stopped and looked at Terry. She asked him how they were supposed to explain her suddenly becoming a girl. Terry had no idea how this was going to play out. It was different, strange, and unbelievable, but whatever happens, they'll face it and handle it together. Leroy nodded, and the two walked back to class to start the first day of the rest of their beautiful, loving lives together.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Also check out my Patreon and DeviantArt pages. There you can find all my public stories. You can also support my work by getting early access to all stories, exclusive content, and even commission me to make you a custom story. Anyways, thanks again for watching. I hope you have a great day.